direct people to a couple of handouts in that folder before we start up with content, because I think there are a couple that might be helpful. Let me share my screen here and just point out one of the handouts in that folder is the MTSS implementation guide. And this is one of the resources that I've provided to my members of the Reading Science Academy. It is a pared down version of something called the LAP-G that we use at Mount St. Joseph University, that's used in schools implementing MTSS in Ohio. And it's sort of a pared down version of something called the RTFI that they use in Michigan's MTSS model, or the SAMI that they use in Florida. But I wanted to just draw people's attention to the section about tiered supports on page 3. That might help you self-assess where you are with some of those components of tiered instruction. And then the other handout that I would draw your attention to is the one that has assessment in the title. So it is a way to self-assess what you have in place in terms of an assessment system, and that is where we're going next. So some characteristics of screening, diagnostic, and progress monitoring assessments. So you might want to have those two resources as references available for you as we go forward. And let me go back to my slides here and we will carry on. Oh, interesting. When I go to share it, oh, I see, I have to have them actually displaying. Let's try this. Okay, so we're going to pick up where we left off. We've been talking today, excuse me, about MTSS as the framework for implementing the science of reading. And we talked about some highlights from the reading research, including the fact that reading is not natural. The simple view of reading helps inform what we prioritize for instruction and intervention. We should be providing instruction that is explicit and systematic, and focusing on prevention. We talked about the elements of the 3 tiers of MTSS. And I want to talk now a little bit about going into these core components of MTSS, what I'm trying to depict as the base of the triangle. Everybody's familiar with that triangle model of MTSS. I'm trying to extend your thinking beyond matching students to intervention and into the realm of changing your system, organizational development, enhancing the capacity of your school system to meet the needs of every student, maximizing the opportunities that you have in the instructional structures that exist within your school. So I'm going to highlight or elevate 4 components, elements of your system that need your attention. And so I want to start with the assessment system. This will be component number 1 that we'll spend a little bit of time on. And that PDF that I just directed you to will give you a chance to self-assess where are you, or where is your system towards implementing a school-wide assessment model. So there's lots of indication in the effective school-wide intervention literature about the need to have not just a single assessment, but a system of assessments. All assessment is driven by questions. The assessment that you use, which assessment, when you use an assessment, if you don't use an assessment, all of that depends on the question that you have. We're going to talk about the questions in just a bit when we talk about the problem-solving process, but I want you to be thinking about making selections within your school and board or district based on questions about students. I'm going to suggest that you need assessments to answer 4 fundamental questions that will help you build an effective MTSS. Question number 1 is, which students and systems need support? This question is answered by universal screening assessments. So screening is a category of assessment that helps you answer certain kinds of questions. Questions like which students are at risk and need support, which systems are at risk and need support. And I imagine if you've been thinking about universal screening at all, you've probably only been thinking about that student question. But I'm going to try to show you how screening data is most effectively used, and that is to identify instructional systems that are at risk. Because again, you can't solve the problems for students, one student at a time. You need to have a picture of how healthy your instructional systems are. The second question that you need to answer when you're implementing MTSS is, why is the problem happening? What is the specific problem? And why is that happening? So how and why kinds of questions. And those are answered by diagnostic assessments. And as you'll see in just a minute, screening and diagnostic are two different kinds of assessments. I've got them in two different boxes here because they answer two different questions. They are helpful for two different purposes of assessment. You need both kinds of tools. A third question that you need in MTSS is assessments that will answer, is it working? What's the it? Is what we're doing for students working? Is what we have planned for our systems working? Progress monitoring will help answer those questions. And then finally, you need summative assessments that allow you to look back and answer the question, did it work? So the contrast here is progress monitoring tools are answering formatively in real time, is it working as we are implementing? Summative assessment, diagnostic assessment answers, did it work? Looking back to see if it worked. So 4 different purposes, 4 different questions, 4 different types of assessment that you'll need to have within your MTSS model. So I'm going to talk about characteristics of each, give you some examples of each, and any questions that you have along the way, please put those in the Q&A. So let's start with universal screening, which, as I said, answers the question, which students and systems need support. You can think about screening like the check engine light on your car's dashboard, or you can think about screening like the health screeners that are commonly used, temperature, blood pressure, and so on. These are given to all students on a regular schedule. Everybody gets the same screening assessments. They must be brief because we are using them typically 3 times a year with all students. If we're going to take time away from instruction with every student, it has to be brief. We can't take an hour or 45 minutes to do screening multiple times a year with every single student. So universal means all. Now, I want to clarify that a bit. All students in this context would mean all students for whom you have reading expectations, reading in English, I should say, all students who have reading goals on their IEP. There are some exceptions to this. Students who have significant disabilities, cognitive and sensory disabilities, students for whom you're working on feeding goals and positioning goals and movement goals, not goals related to reading. And students for whom you are not teaching to read in English. If you are teaching them to read exclusively in French, for example, then they would not be included in this concept of universal screening. From my perspective, your board might have a different idea. Your Ministry of Education might have a different idea. But from my perspective, that's how I would think about that. Universal screening needs to be standardized. Just like the idea of health screening is standardized, we take the temperature, we have a standard procedure for taking blood pressure and so on. Every student should have the same assessment experience during screening. They should have the same directions, the same test items, the same amount of time. There's a couple of reasons for this. We want to have the option of comparing every student to every other student. So we want to know that the testing conditions were the same for every student. Now, that doesn't mean that the screening has to be norm referenced. People sometimes confuse the terms standardized and norm referenced. They actually mean different things. Standardized is about how the test is given. Norm referenced is one way scores can be interpreted. I'll return to that in just a minute. We want to choose screening tools that are reliable and valid, meaning, excuse me, they're not informal. They have been constructed carefully and tested for their ability to consistently measure the same things in the same way and get the same picture of the student's skills, regardless of who gives them. It's important, in my opinion, for universal screening tools to be predictive. Now, I've already mentioned that my focus is on preventing reading failure. I want to identify reading difficulties as soon as possible, as young as possible. I want to be able to teach with time on my side. So I want to know at the beginning of kindergarten. So I've got the entire kindergarten school year to change that predicted outcome. I'm interested in knowing not just who's at risk, but I want to know what their likelihood of future reading performance is, because the whole enterprise is about changing that outcome, changing future outcomes for students. So I want to use screening tools that are predictive of important reading outcomes in the future. So I know today that the student is or is not likely to meet that future target, and I can change my instruction to influence that outcome in the future. So along those lines, I want to use universal screening tools that are not only predictive, but are specifically indicators of the essential skills. We talked earlier about the 5 essential skills: phonemic awareness, the alphabetic principle and basic phonics, vocabulary and oral language, reading fluency, and reading comprehension. Those broad skill areas that are the priorities for instruction. If those are the things I should be teaching, I want screening tools that indicate exactly those priority skills. I don't need to screen on every single objective I have for the grade level. This is the really good part about working in literacy, is that we already know a lot about which aspects of literacy, the 5 essential skills, and even within those 5 skills, which discrete skills function as really good indicators of the whole skill area, as well as predictors of future reading performance. I think this is important for minimizing the amount of time we take away from instruction to give screening assessments, and so that we have actionable information. In some cases, if we're screening on everything we expect students to do at the end of the year, it's overwhelming to teachers. And frankly, when I look at lists of expectations on standards or curricula, they're not equally important. They're usually created by committee, honestly. Everybody gets their pet skill, onto the list. They're not presented sequentially in terms of simple to complex or in a hierarchy, easier to harder. And so I really prefer screening tools, especially for early literacy, that are both predictive and indicators of those essential early literacy skills. I also have a preference for screening tools that give you information about individual students who are at risk, but also screeners that can be aggregated so you can assess the level of risk in your instructional system. Again, I think this is crucial for MTSS. If all we're doing is finding students and we have unlimited resources, we can provide intensive support to any student who needs it, well, fine, then that's all I need to know. But in most schools I've ever worked with, that's not the case. And we're going to have to make very careful decisions, establish priorities, make plans for improving our instructional system. And we need data that helps us to do that. Rather than having multiple assessments, I would like to choose one universal screening tool that allows me to accomplish all of these goals, that meets all of the criteria that I have identified here. So I am going to use an example to illustrate some of these points. Excuse me. I want to show you where this comes up in the Right to Read Commission's report, and just call out a couple of things for people to think about. So this idea of screening being quick, right? That resonates with me. We can't take too much time away from instruction. They use both the terms informal and standardized here. So I hope that's one of the things that gets clarified as these requirements or recommendations work along as you're moving into next school year. Identifying risk, right? Finding students who are at risk, super important. Also identifying systems who are at risk, I would add to that. This report is suggesting that you screen students in K to 2. I would suggest you screen in K to 6 at a minimum. And this report is suggesting screening twice a year. I would say that's a minimum. And if you're only going to screen twice a year, well, let me back up. I say it's a minimum because I think you need screening data 3 times a year. For me, that would be the minimum. And if you're only going to do it twice a year, my suggestion would be beginning and middle of year. I like to add screening at the end of the year. That would be my third point in time for these reasons. Because you want to see growth across the entire year. You want to measure the effectiveness of your instruction. So you want to see the percentage of students who are at risk decrease as a result of the instruction you provided across the entire school year. I don't want you to think about, I wouldn't recommend only beginning and end of year, simply because there's so much growth that has to happen, so many skills that need to be acquired across K to 2. If you don't have a middle of year screening opportunity, you're missing the fact that students' skills change and shift across the year in K to 2. They're moving from acquiring phonemic awareness, for example, to an emphasis on the alphabetic principle. If you don't do that mid-year checkpoint, you might make the wrong decisions and miss some students. I also like having beginning, middle, and end, so that at the end of the year, you can do that cross grade level articulation where the kindergarten teachers sit down with the first grade teachers and tell the first grade teachers about the skills of the students who will be with them as first graders next year, about the structures that have worked to support them, about where they are with their skills, what tier 1 might need to look like in first grade. So first grade can hit the ground running day 1. They don't have to wait for their beginning of year screening. It will get refined at the beginning of year screening, but they can have a plan that they develop in the spring of the previous school year to hit the ground running day 1 of first grade. So I like that cross grade articulation to happen. So I know that some of the plans for implementing this report aren't finalized. So I'm just throwing out there for, I don't know, whoever might listen to this, who's getting to make these decisions, at least what my thinking is about those screening recommendations.
Dr. Stollar, could I jump in?
Yes,
And
course,
just
please.
while you are mentioning that piece about how frequently screening needs to occur and when ideally it should occur to best capture the risk and how that changes across an instructional year. Sometimes at IDA, we get questions from people who say, okay, well, what if we did our beginning of year screener, beginning of year, and if we find that a particular child is at benchmark, why do we then need to do follow-up screening with them? Isn't that an okay enough indicator of risk? Don't we then know what needs to happen for that child? Is there any response that you would give to a question like that?
Yes, absolutely. It's related to what I said about the skills changing and shifting across K to 2. So if you could imagine, and it would be good if I added a visual here. So I'm just going to paint the picture with my words and gestures. So if you think about those 5 essential early literacy skills, or maybe if you think back to that sort of stair step image that I had of those, there's a general progression or a path to reading. It's not a lockstep progression. I'm talking about a general sequence that students need to move through from phonemic awareness to the alphabetic principle and phonics to accurate reading of text, fluent reading of text, and reading comprehension. What you are screening on at various grades and time of year should match that progression. I'm going to take first grade because I think that's where the most growth and development of reading skills really happens. It's a very compact and important year. At the beginning of first grade, you might want to screen on a skill like phonemic awareness because it's such an essential foundation. You want to make sure every first grader is starting the year with that tool under their belt. So screen on phonemic awareness at the beginning of the year. You might also be screening on letter sound and the ability to blend letter sounds to decode basic words. You're certainly going to be screening on that at the middle of the year. And by the end of the year in first grade, you're screening on reading comprehension, right? So the skills that are the priorities and the emphasis for instruction shift across the year. Your screening should tap into those skills because it should be communicating who's on track with those skills, who's not on track, so you can adjust your instruction accordingly. If you screen at the beginning of the year and find that a student is on track with what you're screening on at the beginning of the year, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that they will be on track when the skills shift or the expectation increases at the middle or end of the year. The other reason I think it's really important you do universal screening, you screen everybody. So here's the other way I hear this question, Una, come to me. If they're on track at the beginning of the year, why do I have to spend the time to assess them at the middle or the end of the year? And here's why, because we're not just looking for student risk, we're also looking for how effective is our instructional system? What needs to change about our instructional systems? So we need to know beginning, middle, and end of year, the percentage of students who are at risk. It's the job of our three-tiered model to reduce the percentage of students who are at risk from the beginning to the end of the year. If at the beginning of the year, we take out of the mix all of the students who scored on track, who are not at risk, and we don't retest that group of students at the middle and end of year, we don't then have a picture of how effective has our instruction been across the school year. We've taken out of the mix that perhaps higher performing group of students. We can no longer use the screening data to help us design and inform our system of support. So those are two reasons, because of the skills shifting and because I want to use screening data for systems planning. Those are reasons that I encourage you to do the screening 3 times a year. Now we could talk about how to do that efficiently, right? Like I've already said, it should be brief. You shouldn't take a lot of time away from instruction for screening. There are ways to do that so that you minimize the amount of time that you're taking students and teachers away from instruction. Okay, so maybe some of that will come out as we go along. So you heard in the introduction that I used to work for the authors of Acadience Reading at Acadience Learning, and I worked there for 12 years. I worked there for 12 years because of the power of this assessment. So honestly, where this came from is that I learned about Acadience when I was working as a school psychologist, when I was having that frustrating experience of kids waiting to fail to get into the magic special education land, because that was the only way to get help in my system. And I learned about this assessment from Roland Good when it was called, well, actually it didn't have a name. It was that long ago. Then it became Dibbles. And I worked to develop the MTSS model around the state of Ohio. And many of those schools and districts were using what was then called Dibbles, now called Acadience, as their screening and progress monitoring tool. So I had a lot of experiences using it, and I saw what it could do as a tool for conversation among educators, and a tool for changing reading outcomes. So I saw it as this really pivotal component of implementing MTSS. And so I went to work for the authors at Acadience Learning, and I was there for 12 years. And I still feel very passionate about this assessment. I am not an unbiased presenter here. I'm revealing my bias, my strong bias towards this assessment. There and others like it. This one in particular. And just from a practical perspective, I have access to images about it. I know a lot about it, and I've got access to pictures. So I tend to use it in my presentations. So I'm just being upfront about that. If you don't have a screener yet, I'm going to encourage you to look into this one. I think it works really, really well to improve reading outcomes. So as an illustration, as an example of a universal screening tool, I'm going to use Acadience Reading. And so you can see the names of the measures, which is not, this detail is not important. You can see the names of the measures, but you can see that they are indicators of those 5 essential skills that we've been talking about. You can see the grades when they're used and the amount of time that it takes to give each one of those assessments. These are brief. These are reliable and valid. There's 30 years plus of research on their use and development. They are indicators of these essential skill areas, and perhaps more importantly, they are predictors of future reading comprehension. This is why they work so well in the early grades, even beyond 2nd grade. We'll talk about that in just a second. Well, let's talk about it now, because somebody asked a question. What would you use for screening beyond 2nd grade? And I would suggest that you screen reading comprehension from really the middle of 1st grade on up through the end of 2nd grade. You should be screening on reading comprehension as one of the components. Once you get into 3rd grade, middle of 2nd grade and on, you're pretty much only screening on reading comprehension. In my experience and knowledge of assessment and assessment research, oral reading fluency is my preferred tool for screening on reading comprehension. Oral reading fluency, if you're not familiar with it, is the act of giving students a grade level passage of text that they haven't seen before, giving some standardized directions, asking them to read for a minute, scoring based on standardized procedures, taking the passage away and asking them to talk about what they've read. The oral reading fluency assessment has more than 3 decades of research on its function as both an indicator of reading comprehension and a predictor of reading comprehension. And this seems counterintuitive, I think. The first time you hear this, you think, well, that's just about speed. That's not about comprehension. I would encourage you to look into the research on this if you would like, or to try it out with your own students. In my experience, when teachers take any reading comprehension assessment that they're familiar with or comfortable with and rank order their students highest to lowest, it could be on a very comprehensive reading achievement test, highest to lowest, and then they give oral reading fluency and rank order their students highest to lowest. They get almost a 1-to-1 match. This has been shown in the research over and over again. In fact, the correlation between words correct per minute on ORF and reading comprehension, any way you want to measure it, in primary grades is about a 0.9. So for 9 out of 10 students, if you know their words correct per minute score, it is lining up. You know something about their reading comprehension. It indicates that they are also understanding what they're reading. Now, 1 out of 10 students, that's not going to be a match. They might be accurate and fluent and still not understanding what they're reading, or they might be fluent. Did I say that wrong? Accurate and fluent, not understanding, accurate and fluent, but not understanding what they're reading, or they might not be accurate or fluent and still seem to understand. The mismatch can happen for 1 out of 10 in either direction. When you move into fourth, fifth, and sixth grade, that relationship between words correct per minute on ORF and reading comprehension is still quite strong. It's not quite as strong. The correlation might be something like 0.7 or 0.8. So 2 or 3 students out of 10. But in terms of universal screening, with all the factors that need to go into making a choice about that, oral reading fluency still gets my vote because it takes very little time to find out who is likely to be understanding what they're reading and who is probably not understanding what they're reading. So even in 3rd through 6th grade, we should be screening on comprehension. And in my opinion, the very best way to do that is with oral reading fluency. I want to see if there are follow-up questions to that, because I know that grade 2 and above screening was a specific question that we got earlier.
That was a specific question. And I think that's quite a comprehensive and clear answer to that. I think sometimes I think some of the confusion might stem from the specific grade bands that the OHRC recommended, that K2 window, because I think sometimes there is that misunderstanding that, okay, we would want to screen for, our beginning readers in, phoneme segmentation and nonsense word decoding. But then after that point, once we have ideally established readers, something like a PM benchmark or a running record or a DRA might be fine at that point. So I appreciated your point that when we're thinking about the reliability of tools and what research indicates are effective ways to get at that comprehension outcome, that ORF measure can still be a very reliable and valid indicator, even for students beyond grade 2.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And certainly in grade 2. Students in grade 2 are still acquiring word recognition. Sometimes we've stopped teaching phonics and decoding in grade 2, but that's a mistake, I think. The data that I've seen, national data about students' ability to read CVC words at the beginning of 2nd grade in the US suggests that only about 40% of our students hit that mark. And I think that is very closely connected to the struggles that we see with reading comprehension beyond grade 2, right? If you can't accurately lift the words off the page, that is going to limit the amount of time you spend reading. Let's just take it there. It's going to make it so that you don't choose to spend time reading because your reading is labored and difficult. It's not something you're going to choose to do in your free time. You will not love to do it if it's hard for you. You'll spend less time reading, and then that limits the content knowledge you can gain through reading. It limits the new vocabulary that you'll be exposed to, the complexity of text that you'll be exposed to. It limits the discussions you can have with your peers in class, and it is a key contributor to that red and green line diverging over time. It's one of the main reasons why students can't get to the point of reading to learn. And so it creates that disparity. And it's something that we can do something about, even if we're not screening until the beginning of 2nd grade. If that's our first opportunity, we still can use ORF to direct instruction for students and get that gap closed as soon as possible. So yeah, even up into 7th and 8th grade, I like ORF because we should be screening on comprehension. Now, the piece that we're going to go to next is diagnostic assessment. So I know that your report is requiring screening. I don't remember reading in there any requirements about diagnostic, maybe recommendations, but they were.
I don't believe so. Joanne and Alicia could correct me and jump in if I missed that. But I believe the recommendation was specific to early screening. I don't believe there are any recommendations to diagnostic assessment.
So this is the
progress monitoring either, to be honest. Alicia and Joanne, any thoughts?
No, you're right, Una. You're right.
So we really need to be thinking about an assessment system, right? So if I left you with just ORF as screening in 2nd grade, let's say, you might think, well, I'm going to need some other assessments to tease out where to direct my instruction. And I would say, yes, that's true. And that's where diagnostic assessment comes in. So when we talk about diagnostic, we can return to this question because you have to have the full complement of tools. You have to get the full picture of what's going on for students. Okay, so here's a picture from the Acadience Learning Online system. I should say that Acadience is available in a variety of ways. One of the reasons I use it as an illustration is because you can get it for free. It's available for free download, or if you don't want to make your own copies, you can purchase classroom sets, or you can purchase software for giving it on a mobile device. That's what you're looking at here. What the screening tool tells you is how students are doing relative to a criterion, relative to a benchmark goal that tells you if the student has scored enough on that essential skill to be an okay reader in the future, to be predicted to have reading comprehension in the future. Students who are on track for good outcomes in the future, their scores will be represented in green or blue. Students who are not on track for good outcomes in the future, their scores will be represented in red and yellow. So you can get a picture of your class. That's what this is showing, one teacher's class, and you can identify students who need instructional support. This is the purpose of screening, right? To find early the individuals who need support because they are at risk due to their current level of skills and what that skill level predicts about their performance in the future. So in this case, you can see there's a lot of need in this classroom. You don't even have to know what the colors are connected to. There's just a lot of red and yellow here, right? Lots and lots of students who are at risk. One of the nice things about Acadience and tools like it is that those screening results can be aggregated. You can get a picture of the percentage of students who are at risk. This is related to universal screening, which systems need support, right? So I can look at something like, this is first grade at the beginning of the year, and I can see that my first grade instructional system is at risk. So here's the overall picture of how students are doing. I think that's what's represented over on the right-hand side here. Only about 17% of these first graders are on track for good reading outcomes in the future. You can see specifically which skills students need support on, segmenting phonemes, matching sound to letter, blending letter sounds, and so on. So this is the kind of data, I should say, these are the sort of data that you must have in screening to be able to do the system level planning required in MTSS. It's not enough to know the students who are at risk. You need to be able to aggregate the results across students and look at the percentage of students who are at risk so you can make judgments about the effectiveness of your instruction and how to improve the effectiveness of your tier 1, 2, and 3 instructional systems. This is the part that I find most schools, when they try to implement MTSS, they are missing. They're using their screening results to find the students who are at risk, and then they're going straight to intervention with those individual students. That's a mistake. You'll only be able to chip away at the edges and make small little improvements to student reading outcomes if you're trying to approach it one student at a time in systems where there's a lot of need, right? If you're in a school where everybody comes to kindergarten pretty much on track and they stay that way, then it's a different scenario for you. Most of the places that I work, that's not the case, and there's a lot of need. So rather than going student by student, MTSS has you aggregating your screening results to be able to plan for what that system of increasingly intensive supports should look like. Okay, so that's what you need the screening data to do for you. Now, I have a preference, as I mentioned, to universal screening tools that allow you to know not just who's at risk, but where are they specifically relative to a cut point. Okay, so I talked about those benchmark goals that come with Acadience reading and assessments like it. They are a criterion referenced way of interpreting scores. This is different from a norm referenced interpretation of scores. Remember, I said standardized and norm referenced are two different terms that are often confused. Standardized refers to the way a test is given and scored. Norm referenced is a way scores can be interpreted. That means that we are taking an individual student's score and comparing it to a group of students who also had the same test. So to take it outside of reading, I can use an example of a little child who is 40 inches tall, and I might ask, is he tall? A norm referenced way to interpret his height is to compare him to other students his age. And I could say his height is at the 75th percentile compared to other students his age. That would be a norm referenced interpretation of his height. We do this in reading. We do this in academic areas. We interpret scores sometimes against other students, and we say this student is at the 40th percentile or they're at the 78th percentile. It's one way of interpreting screening results. I personally think it is limited when it comes to early literacy, because when it comes to early literacy, I don't want to know how did a student compare to other students. I want to know, does that student have enough of the skill and what's their predicted outcome in the future? So a criterion referenced way of interpreting height, for example, would be to ask, is that same 40-inch tall student tall enough for something like riding a roller coaster at an amusement park, right? You've all seen those signs that say you must be this tall to ride. And if the criterion is 48 inches, this child's not getting on the roller coaster, even though compared to other students his age, he's at the 75th percentile. He's taller than most. He's not tall enough. This is the analogy that I want you to think about when you're choosing a universal screening tool. Does it tell you not just where does the student compare to other students in your system or other students around the world, but does the student have enough of this essential skill that they are predicted to be okay in the future? Okay, I don't know if there are questions about that. Feel free to drop them in the chat while you are reflecting on your own universal screening. So this is part of that assessment PDF that's in the handout folder. I want you to jot down the screening tools that you're currently using, if you are using any. And then I want you to think about their characteristics. These are some of the characteristics that I was sharing with you. Does your current screening tool share those characteristics? Is it in place or not? Jot down some notes about that. Is there something that you might need to change about your current screeners? Or are you just thinking about adopting a screening tool? Those criteria would give you some things to think about when making those selections.
Could I jump in and ask you a few quick questions while we're on screeners?
Please.
Okay. I really liked this question. How can parents be involved in screening or understanding their child's risk for reading, depending on screening data? What is the role of parents with the universal screening process?
So with the process or in understanding their own child's
exactly.
results?
Would screening data be shared with parents?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the data should absolutely be shared with parents. If you're screening 3 times a year, you should send those data home 3 times a year. You should do whatever you can to equip parents and family members with information about the screening tool. So describing in parent-friendly terms, what are you screening on? What are the skills? What is the criterion that you're using for saying on track or at risk, right? For the categorization of students. What does it mean if the student scores below that threshold? What does it mean in terms of, if you're using something like Acadians, the prediction of their future performance? And maybe more importantly, what does it mean for what you are going to be doing in the classroom, right? So screening should be that jumping off point for a conversation with parents and an opportunity, hopefully, to engage them as a partner in working with you to change the predicted outcome. I understand there's some sensitivity around this when this gets framed as screening for dyslexia. I have some qualms about that myself. I think it's difficult to talk to parents, kindergarten, first grade students. Maybe I should say I'm of mixed mind about this. To talk to parents of kindergartners and first grade students about screening for dyslexia or risk for dyslexia. This is a complicated thing, and it needs to really be thoughtfully navigated and planned. And I'm sure you all at IDA Ontario have really good resources and ideas about this. I think it's important to share with parents the way your student is performing these skills today indicates to us that we need to change our instruction because it doesn't look like they're on track for where we want them to be in the future. So we have a responsibility now to respond to this screening data, make changes, provide supports to your child. Here's specifically what we plan to do so that we change that prediction. And we're going to check in again in a month, in 3 months, whatever the case may be, and see if those things that we've put in place to support your child are working sufficiently, or if we need to add to or revise what we're doing. And here's how you can support our efforts at home, if you're so inclined, right? Like that kind of conversation. We are screening for this because we understand that dyslexia is something that students are, well, you might have to explain dyslexia a bit, right? Like what it is, but we understand that dyslexia is something that children are born with. And if they have an immediate family member with dyslexia, they're at increased risk of having dyslexia. And it's something that if we identify the factors related to dyslexia early, we can minimize the impact. If the student does actually have a disability like dyslexia, we can minimize the impact of that on their future academic performance. So we want to know as soon as possible. We're not saying your child has dyslexia. This screening tool can't identify dyslexia. We're not trying to alarm you, but we're telling you this is on our radar. It's our responsibility because it can, the characteristics and signs of dyslexia can be found very early on. And if we act on that information, it can really have a positive influence on your child's academic performance in the future. That's the kind of conversation. I don't know, you all are the experts and can add to or revise that. So if there's anything I said that makes your hair stand up and like, oh no, don't say that, please give me that feedback.
I don't think so at all. I think I appreciated how you mentioned the links to here's what we're going to be doing about it in school. Here's how we'll know whether that's working. And then here's how you can support at home. Should that be, should that be something you're interested in? I think, again, linking that screening risk in terms of, but here's what we're going to do about it.
That's the whole reason to do screening. It's the whole reason to do the screening. If you're not going to do anything about it, don't waste your time collecting the data. The whole reason is to change the outcome. And as I mentioned very early on in the workshop, one of the key findings from the reading research is we can prevent most reading problems, right? So this is why we should find out early so that we change the instruction and change that outcome. Really important. Anything else related to screening before we move on? Because I know you said this is what's on the horizon for all of you in Ontario. So I want to make sure we've covered it.
There are sometimes questions that pop up with screening. Should screening data be incorporated in report card grades?
Oh, Gosh,
And I wanted to make sure we got that one in front of you
this is a
because it's a hard one. I know.
tough one. This is this is maybe too much about me, but I have these little topics that I like to investigate and go into that I keep a list of, and then I dole them out because I can't, deal with more than one at once. This is my current topic that I'm trying to explore because when people are making the shift and incorporating reading research into their instruction, this question comes up very early on because they start to realize the way that they are evaluating students and the way that they are communicating to family members all of a sudden doesn't line up with their assessment and instructional practices. And I don't feel like I've had really good suggestions for educators in this area. And I think part of that is I don't have proper appreciation for assigning grades. I think that's just the honest truth. I just don't have proper appreciation for it. So should your screening data be something that is part of your grading system? No. I'm gonna go back to my days at Acadience Learning. They actually have a position paper on this that I could point you to. They don't want their screening assessment to be used for high stakes decisions like retention or grades on a report card. Screening should be low stakes. The worst thing that happens to you if you score low on screener is you get instruction, right? Like that's it. That's the purpose of it. It's not for evaluating teachers. It's not for grading students. However, okay, so you're not going to have an A equals scoring at benchmark and a B equals scoring below benchmark and a C, right? Or any satisfactory or any other kind of categorization. So the authors of the assessment would caution you against doing that. They would prohibit you from doing that. And however, the skills that are indicated by a screener like Acadience are the essential components of reading. So to me, what does grading, I'm not done thinking through this. So this is just my current
We're not going to hold you to anything. Don't
preliminary
worry.
thinking. I'm gonna say it out loud so people can react to it and give me feedback and help shape my thoughts. You should map out for yourself as a grade level. What are the expectations at the end of the year? What do we expect as a result of our efforts every child comes out of this grade level with? And then and that should be aligned to research. Research should inform that. And then you should map that out, in a hierarchy across the school year. You should have a scope and sequence that informs your work across the year. And you should have, mile markers that tell you, is the student on course to get where you want them to be at the end of the year? And I think it's something about those mile markers, those demonstrations of, did your instruction work for this student along the way? Are they, on track to be where you want them to be at the end of the year? That's what you communicate in grades. And so it can be something like, they've acquired this skill that we've taught. They are acquiring this skill that we've taught, that we're teaching. They're acquiring this skill with support, or even with support, they're still struggling to acquire the skill. I don't know, something like that to categorize grading. Now I'm going down a rabbit hole just because this is a current interest of mine. I don't have good answers other than don't use the screener for grades.
I think that right there is helpful. I think not to put my own perspective onto it, but
I'm interested.
But from what I've heard from a lot of Ontario educators, our current curriculum, our current standards are not necessarily fully aligned with research. So it's hard to have a grade and a report card comment that adequately describes the child's progress in terms of how they are they meeting expectations, when the standards themselves might be a little bit more rooted in 3Qing and might not be geared towards those essential skills. So I think that puts teachers in a bit of a funny space. Yep. So my understanding and my hope is that will become a little bit less gray and a little bit less fuzzy when we have new curriculum standards in September. So I hope that will make it a little bit less murky for teachers to sort through.
And you're making me think to mention a suggestion that maybe this is obvious and people are already doing it, but you know, in Ontario, you're in this situation of being influenced to make change towards the reading research, right? You have external pressure to make change in this direction towards the reading research. I think it would be important for boards to communicate to the community that you're in this context, that you're on a journey, and that, you know, more will be revealed over time, right? Like you are learning as educators and changing, and things are going to look different to the family members. Like, and it's not all going to be perfect day one. I think you really need to communicate that. Anybody who's moving towards the science of reading, your instructional practices, your grading practices, your assessment practices, your way of doing business in the school will be changing. And rather than letting parents like stumble upon that as things look different to them, you should just be upfront and say, we are professionals and we are continuously improving our craft. And so here are some things that we're changing and we don't have it quite figured out yet, and we'll keep you posted, and you know, that sort of thing. Just be upfront. And grading, it's going to evolve. I think it's going to evolve over time.
It will.
Yeah. Okay. Let's chat a little bit about the second category of assessment that schools need when they are implementing an MTSS model. And those are the diagnostic assessments that answer the question, exactly what should we teach next, right? So diagnostic assessment answers a question that is different from the question that screening assessment answers. These are, if you had a Venn diagram, screening and diagnostic assessment, there's no overlap. These are two different assessment purposes, two different questions that are being answered. The tools are constructed and created for two different questions, so there's no overlap here. You're going to need different assessments. Your screeners cannot function as diagnostics. Screeners are only going to get you so far in knowing what to teach. They are by design brief. Screening is going to put you into the ballpark of it seems to be a problem with decoding, but you're going to need diagnostic assessment to go deep into and target exactly what do you need to teach next. Where screening is given to all students, diagnostic assessment is only given when you aren't sure what to teach next. Okay. It is an in-depth assessment of a single skill area. Screening is tapping into multiple skill areas that are important at that grade and time of year. Diagnostic assessment is going deep into a single skill area. These assessments may or may not be standardized. They may or may not be timed, but they're not the informal things that teachers create. There are enough good diagnostic assessments out there already carefully constructed that you can use. One of the main criteria of diagnostic assessment is it must be linked to instruction. You absolutely need to know, as a result of spending time away from instruction on the assessment, what to teach next at a very fine-grained level of detail. Here are a couple of diagnostic assessment examples. This is from 95% group. This is their PSI assessment. This is a free diagnostic assessment from Really Great Reading called the Beginning Decoding Survey. There's a companion called the Advanced Decoding Survey. Placement tests that come with good instructional programs and good intervention programs can function as diagnostic assessments. So if you have a good intervention program, I think this one comes from Corrective Reading, it will have a placement test that functions as a diagnostic assessment. So you can take a look at the criteria on my assessment PDF to help you assess the characteristics of tools that you're currently using. I expect from past experience, many of you don't have anything to write in here. When I work with teachers, this is what they often tell me, that they may have screening in place, but they don't have diagnostic tools, or they're using something informal, or something that's not going to really give them the information that they need, like a running record, for example, that doesn't fit these characteristics. So the third question, the third purpose of assessment that you'll need in an MTSS model is progress monitoring to answer the question, is it working? This is like the GPS on your phone or in your car. It's going to drop a pin, where is the student today? It's going to show you where do you want to get to in the future, and it's going to chart a course to get from point A to point B. These assessments are used repeatedly, not just 3 times a year, but as often as weekly. So they must be brief. They must be standardized. I'm not talking about informally checking in with, like a, well, I'm not talking about informally checking in with something that the teacher creates. I'm talking about a standardized assessment. Every single time you give it, you're measuring at the same level of difficulty with alternate forms, so that you can see growth over small increments of time, such as weekly. Here's a picture of what that might look like. This is an example, again, with Acadians. I want to mention that, going back to my idea of Venn diagrams, diagnostic assessments can't be used for progress monitoring, but screening assessments can. And you can get some efficiency here when you choose a universal screening tool that also functions for progress monitoring, because it contains those alternate forms at the same level of difficulty. That's what allows you to put dots on a graph and be able to visualize the learning that's happening, or the learning that's not happening fast enough, that allows you to make a change to instruction to get the student back on track. This is what kind of picture we want for progress monitoring. I'm not going to spend much time on outcome evaluation. People are familiar with this. This is the kind of achievement testing that you do at the end of the year to see, did students meet your grade level standards? You're looking back to see, did my instruction work? Did our instruction at this grade level allow students to meet those objectives? Okay, I'm gonna leave you with the non-examples as we go to break. How about that? That's like drop a bomb and go to break. So I think it's helpful to articulate the assessments, to clarify the assessments that don't fill these purposes, that don't meet these functions: screening, diagnostic, and progress monitoring. These are tools that people are familiar with. Just to put things in perspective, they don't meet the criteria of screening, diagnostic, or progress monitoring that I've been sharing with you. So I'm happy to respond to follow-up questions related to that before we go to our break.
I think we are looking pretty good for questions. There was a question that I'm just halfway in the middle of responding to, but it might be faster for you to do it instead of me typing furiously in the chat. Just to clarify again, that difference between diagnostic and progress monitoring tools. I had gotten halfway through by saying that diagnostic allows us to answer which skills need to be taught, and they might be, a lengthier assessment that we might just do once, versus progress monitoring being much quicker, much briefer, to judge, is that instruction working?
Yes, and in addition, progress monitoring is standardized and timed. Diagnostic is often not standardized or timed. Those would be dividing lines to clarify. Progress monitoring is feedback to the instructor. It's feedback about the effectiveness of your instruction. Are you on the right track with this student, or do you need to change your instruction? Diagnostic assessment, as you said, is often only done one time, following screening, to tell you, okay, we know it's an issue somewhere about accurate word reading, but diagnostic is going to tell you, it's our controlled vowels. That's where we need to start. So that's how you want to distinguish among those.
Stephanie, I wonder if you wouldn't mind answering a specific question about Brigance.
Sure,
question,
I'll try.
our teacher here says, and I'm not aware of this, so I'll just read the question out to you. Why would Brigance not be diagnostic? Some of it seems very similar to core phonics to me.
Only because I'm trying to distinguish between, I should have said this earlier. I don't mean diagnostic in terms of diagnosing something. So I'm talking about instructionally relevant diagnostic assessments. And I don't find people using the Brigance to inform instruction as much as they use it as part of a battery of assessments, a psychoeducational evaluation where they're looking to make a determination of identification of a disability. And maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe it has more instructional relevance than I'm aware of. But that would be how I would, that's why I categorized it in this way.
Thank you.
Okay, so as promised, we are going to start up with a little bit of a check for understanding on purposes of assessment, the 4 types of assessment that we were discussing right before the break. Okay, so if you can remember back to those, an assessment that tells you if students are learning what you are teaching. So in real time, if they are learning what you are teaching, which of the 4, your choices are screening, diagnostic, progress monitoring, or outcome evaluation. The one that tells you if students are learning what you're teaching is progress monitoring. The assessment that tells you if students met the grade level standards and objectives, so that summative look back, did they learn what you've taught? That's outcome evaluation. Assessments that tell you who is at risk, which systems are at risk. That's the question answered by universal screening. And assessments that tell you what to teach. That's diagnostic assessment. Screening gives you limited information about what to teach. In kindergarten, that's pretty much all you need to know in most cases is from screening data, but the specifics, and certainly as you go up in the grade levels, you're going to also need diagnostic data to decide what to teach next. Okay, so the 4 components that are at the base of the MTSS triangle, that's what we're working our way through now. We've unpacked component number 1, which is to have a school-wide assessment system. In Ontario, you are being required to move towards having universal screening. I'm encouraging you, if you want to implement MTSS, to also have diagnostic and progress monitoring tools. The second core component is tiered instruction. We've talked quite a bit already about tiered instruction. Oh, and I just realized I neglected to add the URL to the bottom of this slide. This image comes from Ohio's Dyslexia Guidebook, and you can find that online, but I will make sure that what goes out to folks includes that URL where you can find this. I want to give it proper attribution since it's an image in that particular source. So you can see an overview here, the kinds of things that we've already been talking about in terms of descriptions of each of the 3 tiers, who's involved in planning and designing each of the 3 tiers, what kinds of assessments are involved, the group size, the amount of time involved, who should get each one of those tiers of assessment, and so on, just by way of sort of overview, summarizing the things that we've already talked about. I want to focus in on something that struck me in your Right to Read report, which was this statement: many more students need reading intervention because classroom instruction in word reading is not based on reading science. It's a pretty bold statement. May not be based in reading science in terms of language comprehension either. I don't know. I'm just putting that out there, but they're calling out the word recognition component, which is probably appropriate. The need for reading interventions exceeds the available spots. Boy, isn't that the truth? Isn't that the pain that we experience, whether we're educators or family members of struggling readers? This is the reality, right, that many of us are facing. So many students never receive those interventions in school or receive them far too late. Two tragedies that can be prevented. Perhaps that's the worst of this, is that this doesn't have to be the case. This may be the current state of affairs. This may represent, the fact that you all are working as hard as you can with what you know. But as I've been mentioning, the MTSS model is a deliberate alternative to having to continue getting these kinds of results. And in the time that we have together, I thought it might be most helpful to illustrate and discuss some of the elements of effective tier 1 instruction, rather than talking about all 3 tiers, because I've already put it out there that tier 1 instruction is risk reduction, right? That's where the biggest bang for your buck is. I thought we'd focus there in the next little bit. So here are some things to think about related to designing tier 1 instruction and improving the effectiveness of your tier 1 instruction. Just a short list of priorities in terms of the timing. So scheduling, timetabling, if you will, determining what to teach, how to teach it, what to use to teach. So routines and materials, and then how to group students for that instruction. I'm just going to give you a couple of illustrations or some models of things to think about that I've seen to be effective. The schedule is one of the real challenging components to MTSS. This is where you're going to need the support of your administrators. This is one of the most important topics for board level team meetings, school level team meetings, and grade level team meetings, is mapping out the schedule. Having this 90 to 120 minutes of protected time for reading instruction and letting the needs of your students drive the schedule. There are many competing forces, right? If you're sharing a music teacher with another building in your community, if you have, well, you will have many competing demands in terms of curricular expectations. This is the reality. You're going to have to do the best you can to work it to your students' advantage. How much time you need for tier 1 instruction should be determined based on your screening data. The more students you have at risk, the more time you're going to want to allocate for tier 1 instruction. As I mentioned earlier, this will naturally mean everyone can't teach reading in the morning, because you have to have the flexibility to have supportive educators come to the classroom to support small group differentiation and to support, in some cases, the needs of students who require more intensive support, even in tier 1. So all hands on deck is the idea. And this may seem like something that is impossible to move towards. I'm going to suggest as a starting place that you prioritize K2, which is in alignment with your right to read report, and even perhaps prioritize one grade level in K2 where you could start getting this right, where you could create, let's say, the first grade schedule first, and the entire rest of the building has to fit around the first grade schedule. I've seen that work really well to prioritize a grade level, start there, and then let that success trickle up or down, as the case may be, across the other grade levels. Here's an example of a sample schedule. Nothing magic about this. This is not meant to be like, you should do it this way. There's lots of ways to organize your schedule. But what I would point out from this example is that there is a small group component to tier 1 instruction articulated. And you'll notice across K to 3, it's happening at a different time of day. I don't think I've got them all circled, no. Where small group part of tier 1 happens is staggered across the day. This allows for special educators, SLPs, reading support staff, learning specialists to come to the classroom to support small group differentiation. So they're moving through the building, so to speak, on that schedule. This building also had what I need time or win time. This is tier 2. This is the extra dose at another time of day of the small group that students were receiving in tier 1. So you can see that that is also staggered across the particular grades. Some grades it's first thing in the morning, other grades it's the last thing they do at the end of the day. Okay, so this is one way of prioritizing tier 1 instruction, bringing resources, other adults to that tier 1 instruction, maximizing the number of instructional minutes, and getting a schedule that actually implements tier 2 as an extra dose at another time of day. Here is a picture of scheduling within the tier 1 reading block. Again, this is not meant to be like you have to do it this way. This is meant to be an illustration for the sake of conversation. Let me point out a couple of elements here that were specific to this particular school. They had 90 minutes for tier 1 reading instruction. They used their screening data to identify the needs of their students. This was first grade. And based on the percentage of students who were at risk at the beginning of first grade, they made the decision to teach their oral language, vocabulary, listening comprehension, and content objectives in whole group. And they made the decision based on data to spend somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes out of the 90 each day on those objectives or outcomes in whole group. They chose to spend 60 of their 90 minutes in small skill-based groups. And they did those groupings not just within the classroom, but across the grade level, and more on that in a minute. So they had 20 minutes of small group instruction. They grouped their students based on skill deficits, and they prioritized the students who were the most struggling. This was group 1 and 2, so that they received small group instruction with the teacher or another skilled educator every single day, Monday through Friday. And the students who were either on track or close to being on track received that small group time with the teacher just a couple of times a week. What they were working on during the small group time of core instruction was the phonemic awareness and spelling skills, reading fluency, and reading comprehension. So based on their screening data, they made this decision because there was such variation among their students on phonemic awareness, decoding and encoding. They decided that that's what they would teach during small group. And because it lends itself to a heterogeneous grouping, they were doing the language comprehension and content objectives during whole group time. One of the things that people often ask about is, what are the other students doing when the teacher is with a small group? And so I added a description of that here, and we could elaborate on this if you want, but the important parts of this have to do with the fact that you don't want students doing anything during independent work time that you haven't seen them do correctly in front of you in whole group or small group. So if you think about the learning hierarchy, the progression that that humans go through as they're learning anything new, you have to become accurate at it first, and then you can become fluent. And if you think back to the 5 essential skills, we want students to be fluent and automatic in each of those skills. It is instant word recognition and automaticity with language comprehension that produces reading comprehension. So it's not good enough to just be accurate in those skills. You have to be fluent and automatic. And if you think about what does it take to move people from accuracy to automaticity, It is, for the most part, practice. If you go back to that explicit instruction conversation we were having earlier and think about the I do it, we do it, you do it cycle in a lesson, it's the we do it phase where we're working towards accuracy. That's the supported practice with the immediate corrective feedback. That's the bulk of the lesson, the we do it piece. We don't move into the you do it until we see the students do it correctly, right? So the you do it is what can happen during centers, partner work, independent practice time, where we've seen students in the we do it part of the lesson perform the skill accurately, but they need lots and lots of repetitions to move from accuracy to automaticity. Independent partner practice, small group practice, that really lends itself well to centers or literacy stations, things that students can practice independently while the teacher is with a small group. So I'm going to elaborate on some of those routines here, give you an example. This is, again, from one of the tools within my Reading Science Academy, an example of some of the components of a structured literacy lesson, an explicit whole group or small group. Again, you make that decision based on your screening data, moving from phonemic awareness to letter sound decoding and encoding, practicing reading and writing words fluently, applying the new decoding skill in the context of text, releasing students to the you do it piece, to practice to automaticity, with some very general kinds of timeframes connected to each of those. This can be applicable across K-3. You just would swap out the skill that you're teaching. Going back to our earlier conversation about explicit instruction, having this mapped out is very supportive of teachers when the words that you use, the examples that you use, the text that you use is right there for you. And it's very supportive of, well, let me also say, so that the teacher can focus on the high level parts of this, which is that art of matching and adapting this to what each student in front of you needs. So varying the number of repetitions, customizing the feedback, and so on. It's very supportive of students to have these kinds of routines because they get in the groove. I know what to do at this point in time. When you say this, I know how to respond. I know what to say. I know what to write. And it allows the students to focus on what they're actually learning, the content of what they're learning. So just to ward off the misunderstanding that the science of reading is only about phonics instruction, I wanted to show you an example of an explicit vocab routine, just to illustrate the fact that we can still be explicit even when we're teaching skills within the language comprehension domain. So this is what that is attempting to illustrate. Okay, so let me, to wrap this up, let me show you the concept at that first grade of grouping across the grade level. So this comes from Sharon Dunn and her work at Loudon Elementary in Bakersfield, California. Sharon's going to be part of the MTSS Innovations Conference with me in March, on the March 2nd date. She led her building to an amazing transformation in student outcomes with a group of very challenged students who had lots of difficulty with learning to read previously, and the changes that Sharon made turned that around for them. Very capable, smart students with very committed family members, and the changes that Sharon made turned around their reading outcomes. One of those changes had to do with their grouping practices. And this image that she created illustrates the way that they did what some people think of as walk to read, to differentiate their tier 1 instruction with first graders. So it's showing the general grouping of students by skill into 4 basic groups. So first grade, these students were the ones who were most struggling up here in the top left. Any student in first grade who was having difficulty with phonemic awareness and letter sound ended up here. I think it was, yeah, down here bottom right, these students were all ready to move on from CVC, CVCE even, to work on vowel teams. So the range of skills across this first grade was vast. And these students were assigned to 4 different homerooms, heterogeneous grouping for homerooms. So just to drive home the fact that this is not tracking, this is not grouping students forevermore or for every part of the school day, every subject, and it's not even for the entire school year. This is quite flexible. So they had 6 students who came from homeroom 1 into this group at the top left corner. These were students who needed to work on the very most basic skills, phonemic awareness and letter sound. There were 3 students in homeroom 2 who needed exactly the same skill work, 4 students from homeroom 3 and 5 from homeroom 4. So during this time of tier 1 instruction, the students moved to join this teacher. It was actually 2 teachers and 2 paraprofessionals for instruction. They were broken down into 4 groups, instruction targeted at their instructional needs. And then you can see that the groups where students are not quite so challenged in learning these skills are larger and have fewer adults working with them. This is the part of the grade level planning and school level planning that is required in MTSS. If you're looking at this and thinking, we don't have any paraprofessionals, we don't have 5 teachers to work with small groups, well, your design of what tier 1 instruction is going to look like will look different, right? When Sharon started this work, she would tell you she didn't have paraprofessionals either. Or I think more accurately, she had paraprofessionals that were serving a different role. They were working more supportively behind the scenes, making copies, helping with bulletin boards, those kinds of more administrative or clerical tasks. And she repurposed them. She used some of her building level funds to buy the time of more paraprofessionals. So she hired additional paraprofessionals, and she used professional development money to train them to do a research aligned instructional program. So this didn't just materialize out of thin air or drop in their lap. It was the result of that system level planning, the collaborative problem solving that Sharon was leading in her building. So I'm going to pause here and see if there are comments or questions about these aspects of designing tier 1 instruction so that it can work for risk reduction.
I think we are looking pretty good in the chat. There was a question for this model. Would this be whole group instruction, or would there be further differentiation between this? What would the instruction look like at this tier 1 model?
So in this case, this was specific to, like, if I would go back here, you could equate it to something like this. During the small group part of tier 1, okay, in this school, it looked like this. So this was the differentiation of tier 1, where they're doing this sort of walk to read model. And they prioritized getting the smallest possible groups for the most struggling students. So you can see down here in the bottom right corner, this is not a small group, right? There were 33 students working with 1 teacher, but they were very strategic, right? In assigning their students, grouping them based on skill, and assigning the adults. So this is happening during the small group portion of tier 1 instruction. And I can tell you, just to go back to the idea of the 3-tiered model, these students would get another dose of this small group instruction during tier 1, or if you have something called win time in your school, they're getting that small group instruction on phonemic awareness and letter sound during tier 1, and they're getting that same small group instruction at another time of day for tier 2. What is happening in whole group is the work on the instruction in grade level content, listening comprehension, explicit vocabulary instruction, and building oral language through read alouds and discussion. Again, these decisions are made based on screening data. As I mentioned, if you're looking at screening data like this school was, the needs of the students were diverse. Many students were struggling with the foundational skills, phonemic awareness, and decoding. And so it wouldn't make sense to teach those in whole group. So moving to something more along these lines would be more targeted and a more efficient use of resources. Now, I think there.
Oops, sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, to jump off of that, how frequently would something like this be rejigged in terms of flexibility of students moving within that framework?
Yeah, if I'm remembering correctly, in Sharon's building, that was every 6 weeks. They had data team meetings where they would review their mastery monitoring from their instructional intervention program and make decisions about shuffling these groups about every 6 weeks. So here's to go back to that progress monitoring piece. If you have a structured literacy intervention program that has these built-in mastery checks, and this will sound familiar, there are many programs that do this, that information tells you, did the students learn the content that I've taught up to this point, right? Like it's a mastery check. Have they mastered what I've taught up to this point? That's different from progress monitoring, which is telling you, are they on track for the outcome in the future, right? So in this school, they had these mastery checks that told them for our 6-week period of time in this configuration of grouping for our tier 1 instruction, did students learn what we've taught? And if everybody in the group had the skill, then that group stayed together and they moved on to the next skill. If there was, let's say, 1 out of the 5 students in the group who hadn't, they might move to a different group. So it was on a cycle of about every 6, maybe as long as every 8 weeks. And that seems reasonable to me. I think anything shorter than that, you're shuffling groups too quickly. Much longer than that, you might be leaving students in instruction that isn't working for too long. So somewhere in that 6 to 8 week range seems reasonable to me.
Perfect. Thank you.
I was going to return to a question that I think came up earlier that I didn't adequately address, which was, what if you only have one, I think this was part of it, only have one section at each grade level? What if you don't have any other adults in your building? And I suppose that it could happen that you have no other adults in your building in a rural school. I had a student in a graduate course recently who was in a 1-room schoolhouse. She actually had a co-teacher, but it was 2 of them for K-8. So that still exists. It's possible. And so you're going to have to take the big picture concepts and make it work as best you can to your situation. I find it hard to believe in most cases that you don't have other adults in the building. You probably do. You just probably haven't conceptualized using them to support reading instruction. I've worked with schools where they literally took all hands on the deck as like, that's the method of working. They trained their librarian to deliver reading instruction, their bus driver, their cafeteria workers. They trained everybody. Now, all the obvious people, the certificated staff were involved, the SLP, the social worker, the principal, so on and so on. Even if you, well, could there be schools that don't have special educators? Perhaps that happens. I don't know. If nothing else, you can have a co-teaching arrangement with general ed and special ed.
I see.
Oh, sorry. We're all excited on this point. Just to extend it even further, I wonder about even a smaller scale. I wonder about a classroom teacher with a grade level partner, and even just within those 2 classroom teachers and 2 classes to make a more homogeneous distribution, right? Thinking
That's
about
right.
maybe there's no EA, maybe there is nobody else. But what about just even 2 classrooms to make that to be a little bit more distributed in terms of student need?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the 2 of you are sitting there, most likely, with the same kind of array of students within each of your classrooms. And instead of the 2 of you each planning for 3 or 4 different groups, why don't you sit together, lay out the student needs as a grade level, and then make decisions and choices based on your own preferences, backgrounds, and interests, right? You're going to work with students who are working on this type of skill. I'm going to work with students who are working on this other type of skill, and they're going to cycle through me as if I'm like a station, right? And you're a station. And maybe in that 1 hour, I can work with 2 small groups, you can work with 2 small groups, and we can have this independent workstation over here.
I think
Now,
that's.
Go ahead.
I think that is the solution, Stephanie, when you're short-staffed. Because in this scenario you have here, we have 4 classrooms, the equivalent number of students of 4 classrooms. This could be
That's
4
right.
doing this without extra staff, right?
They absolutely could. They wouldn't get to the level of differentiation that you can if you have extra staff, but you have to do what you can with what you have, right? This is still better than whole group for 120 minutes. And it's still better than me trying to plan for 4 different, levels of skill, and you trying to plan for 4 different levels of skill. Now,
Thank you.
this may be aspirational, what I'm describing here, right? Because think of all the system elements that have to go into making this a reality, right? This is what I want you to start thinking about. Now, you probably start to think about it as barriers. I can't because. Fine, capture those. Then those become the things that your grade level team or school level team have to problem solve. You might be saying, well, we don't have time to plan together. We have no time in our schedule to plan. We don't like each other, right? We don't have any materials to teach small group with. We teach 2nd grade. We don't know anything about teaching basic decoding, right? These are all legitimate and real, I can't because, right? So don't discard those. Don't overlook those. Write those down. That's exactly what you're going to have to resolve and work your way through. Okay. Don't just throw up your hands and say, I can't. Take each one of those realities and systematically work your way through. What's the smallest change you could make to move in this direction that you're willing to actually do, right? That you've got the resources to do, you've got the gumption to try, and so on.
Good.
Take a step, even if it's a small step. Okay, before we jump off of this topic related to Tier 1 instruction as risk reduction, I want to give a caution. I said this morning that the mistake I'm seeing many schools and school leaders make is rushing out and buying programs. At the end of the workshop, I'm going to give you a sample sequence for implementing MTSS, the order in which to take on these things and consider these changes to implementation. And you'll notice I'm not saying the first thing you do is go out and buy a program. This might strike you as strange, but I think that's several steps down the road. I think that you need to learn more about the reading research so you can make an informed decision. I've seen mistakes made too many times. You get a little bit of information about the science of reading, enough to recognize that your current programs are insufficient, your current instructional methods are insufficient, and you have a sense of urgency about changing outcomes for your students. You're committed to that, and you want to rush to making this change. I've seen it backfire so many times, which is why I'm putting the caution tape over this topic. You really want to be thoughtful and take your time here. The more you know, the better selection you're going to make in a program. If you make a quick, hasty selection, you might find yourself backtracking that because it doesn't actually work for your students. You've got to have good assessment data first. The very first thing you should do is find out the needs of your students. You cannot select a program in isolation. Please don't call your neighboring school board and say, what are you using over there? And then go use the same thing. I know many administrators, that's the approach. And I've seen, disastrous outcomes as a result. MTSS is about matching the needs of your students to the instruction you're providing. You've got to know what your students need before you make a selection of any kind of new instructional programs or materials. And I really encourage to have a team in place. This shouldn't be the decision of a board level administrator or a school level administrator alone. This will backfire on you. You need to engage a group of stakeholders, including community members, I would suggest parents, to make decisions when you are changing or replacing programs. So I'm suggesting a couple of tools that you can use to help you when it is the right time for you to make selections of new programs. I created a series of rubrics for choosing materials at tier 1, 2, and 3 for the Colorado Department of Education. You can access not just their list of their list that resulted from those rubrics, but you can get the rubrics from this website. And if you email me, I'm happy to send you the companion scoring guides that go with those rubrics, because I don't think you can necessarily use the rubrics without the scoring guides, but they didn't post them. And if you want a briefer, less in-depth version of those rubrics, the Reading League has an excellent review tool, curriculum review tool. So 2 resources you can turn to. Okay, I want you to think about the things we've just talked about related to tier 1. Think about your issues related to scheduling. Do you have 90 to 120 minutes carved out? Think about how you're using that time. Where are you in moving towards research-aligned instruction? Think about the instructional methods and routines that are being used in tier 1. Think about your materials and programs and your grouping approaches, and jot down some notes for yourself so you can think about next steps. Okay, so we've talked about components of implementing MTSS involving establishing an assessment system and implementing tiered system of support, primarily focusing first on tier 1. And now I want to shift to what I've been referring to all along, which is the collaborative problem-solving process: teaming, shared leadership, and database decision-making. So again, I'm going to launch this conversation with a quote from your Right to Read report. There's little data available at the board or provincial levels to support high-quality decision-making, service delivery, and programming, or to measure and address achievement gaps for groups of students. Good data is not available to support monitoring or accountability. Data is not being used to identify and close equity gaps, an important requirement to prevent systemic discrimination under the code. So you can see how assessment is critical to the change that you're beginning to make. And you can see how the process for using the data is essential. So this is where I want to spend just a little bit of time in the time that we have left. The model that I am most familiar with is called collaborative problem solving. And this is also referred to by schools implementing MTSS as data-based decision-making or data-based individualization when it comes to applying this to individual students. It should be used by teams at all levels of your system. So at the district or board level, at the school level, at the grade level, and at the student level. This same thinking process is used at all levels of your system. This is something that you would not have in place at this point in time. It's something I suggest that you get in place very, very early on. I also want you to be thinking about your existing teams and restructuring and revising those perhaps to be in line with MTSS. MTSS is the framework for implementing the science of reading. It is an overarching school improvement model. Everything that you're doing related to school improvement, positive behavior supports, supporting students with dyslexia or implementing structured literacy, it should all be integrated into this same effort. Here are some suggestions of the people who should serve on your leadership team at the board or school district level. The idea here is to get diverse representation, to make sure that all the voices of your various constituent groups within your board are represented in the planning and decision-making that's happening at the board level. The things that the board leadership team would be discussing would be setting a vision for the future, identifying the priorities and expectations for each school, reviewing the policies that might be standing in the way of implementing MTSS, and evaluating those action plans over time, making sure that there are sufficient resources in place in terms of staffing, professional development, and funding. So funding decisions made based on student outcome data and implementation of MTSS. The board or district leadership team is responsible for guiding the work of the leadership team in each individual school. Those school teams are made up of the people you see here. You would want to have a representative from that district team. You want to have representatives from all constituent groups within your school and your school community. And this team is responsible for reviewing the building data so that they can create an action plan for the school. Just like you would create an individual student intervention plan, this is the intervention for your school. That action plan needs to be in alignment with whatever the district leadership team's plan looks like. So the district or board team has set a vision, they've established goals, they've written an action plan for achieving those goals, and then that gets articulated down at the school level for each school to have a vision and an action plan that allows them to reach those district goals. They will be developing the knowledge and skills of the school level staff to implement that action plan for MTSS. They'll be planning the professional learning and coaching that's necessary for implementing MTSS, providing decisions, making decisions based on funding related to professional development and coaching. And as you might imagine, then the grade level team is following along with articulating what is in the school level plan. So the district or board level gives direction to the school team is giving direction to the grade level team. And these folks are creating the specific plans for implementing MTSS at their grade level. They are articulating the school's action plan for their grade level. So actually putting those actions into place. And it's the responsibility of that grade level team to guide the work of individual student teams for students at their grade level. Now, here's where we form a team around an individual student, right? Remember, not that sort of school level support team. We're moving away from that. We only have to do student level teaming when we're at tier 3, maybe sometimes at tier 2. So this is a team formed around an individual student. It can sometimes include the student themselves when that is age appropriate. They are using the problem-solving model to design that intervention plan, that if you want to think about it as an action plan for the individual student. You can see in the articulation of these teams that MTSS is not about screen and find who's at risk and give those at-risk students an intervention. That's a small sliver of what needs to be considered when implementing MTSS. It is a much more comprehensive school improvement approach. Because you have teams working at all of these various levels, there really needs to be a well-articulated communication plan. And that should work in both directions, right? So the school teams are communicating up to the board level, and the board team is communicating down to the school team. And that happens all across the system. So in that MTSS implementation guide document, you have an opportunity to reflect on the teams that currently exist at the board, school, grade, and student level within your system. And the columns ask you to think about or articulate the purpose of each of those teams, topics that they are working on, the membership, the processes that they use, and how often they meet. So this would be something that would be in the beginning stages of implementing MTSS that you would want to get a handle on. One of the very first things that I would encourage you to do is get these teams in place, give them their charge, get them up and running. So what is it those teams are doing during their meetings? They're implementing the collaborative problem-solving process. So here's a very basic picture of what that involves. This is, as I said, data-based decision-making. We're going to make choices about policy, choices about funding, choices about professional learning, choices about staffing, choices about instruction based on the needs of our students. Data-based decision-making. That's what this is about. And we're going to do that at all levels of our educational system. So this starts with a clear definition of the problem that feeds into analysis of how and why the problem might be happening. The outcome of step 2 is a hypothesis. So just like in the scientific method, we're collecting data here to inform what's the likely reason, what's the hypothesis, our hypothesized reason that the problem might be happening. That hypothesis leads us directly to an action plan. We're going to develop and implement a plan to change this problem, right? Then we're going to monitor over time to make sure that the plan that we put in place is in fact working to eliminate this problem. And if it's not, we might cycle right back through this sequence of steps. If we find in our problem, in our progress monitoring, in our evaluation, that it's not improving the situation, we might go back and make changes to our plan. We might collect more data, or we might define the problem differently. Okay, so one of the nice things about this problem-solving model is that it is iterative. It's self-correcting. You can't get it wrong for too long because you're monitoring, is it working or not? The other nice thing about using this problem-solving model is it applies at all levels of your system. You might be familiar with this kind of thinking, something like this with individual students. I hear people talk about, a plan, do, study, act kind of sequence when they're talking about individual students. So it might be familiar to you in that way. What I'm asking you to stretch to think about is applying that same level of data-based decision-making, not only to individual students, but to situations at the grade level, school level, and board or district level. System level problem solving. Okay, so I want to give you an illustration of how this plays out. And I think with the time that we have left, what I'll do is give you the big picture and point you in the direction of some tools that are in the handout folder. So I'm going to jump ahead just a bit to show you an illustration of this 4-step problem-solving process with an individual student. And what I clicked past here are the details, right? So you've still got it. You've got the illustration of each step. In that handout folder, you have some tools, some forms and so forth to help you with each one of those steps. And what I will do is just hit the highlights and see what questions you have. So we're talking first about applying problem solving for an individual student. His name is Ollie. He's a 1st grader. The first thing that we want to do is conceptualize this difficulty with reading that Ollie is experiencing in an observable and measurable way that takes into consideration the student's skills, right? Like factors related to the student, but also factors related to the instructional environment. So we're going to define the problem, so to speak, in observable and measurable terms. We're going to use screening data to inform that problem definition, and it might look something like this. Ollie should be able to segment phonemes at a rate of at least 40 per minute, but his score is 37. He should be able to match sounds to letters at a rate of 27 per minute and read at least 1 whole word, but his letter sound score is 21 and he reads 0 whole words. Okay, so this gives a very observable, measurable, and specific problem that we can solve. The second step, problem analysis, is where diagnostic assessment data might be helpful. This is where we're fleshing out how and why is the problem. We're collecting data to answer questions that we have. The questions that we generate to help with problem analysis come from the simple view of reading. So we might have questions about language comprehension. We might have questions about word recognition. Certainly we have questions about word recognition because that's where the problem was defined. So we would be choosing a diagnostic assessment to answer our problem analysis questions. And the outcome of that step 2 might be something like the student can blend phonemes and identify initial phonemes, but can't segment all the sounds in words. And he knows common sounds for 6 letters. That's a very specific analysis of exactly where the student's skills are. We would use that diagnostic assessment information to plan instruction, to put instruction in place for Ollie. That instruction might involve teaching the student to segment phonemes, teaching letter names and sounds, how to blend letter names and sounds, and so on. And we would progress monitor over time to make any adjustments to that instructional plan. This is an illustration of how this might play out for an individual student. Now, this is extremely time intensive. Anybody who has tried to do this with an individual student knows that this is not easy. It takes expertise. It takes lots of people contributing to it, and it takes a lot of time. So again, this is why we want to use instruction to reduce the number of students who we need to do this intensive problem solving with. So if you are sitting in a school that has lots of students who are at risk, if your class looks like this, more students at risk than not at risk, you are going to have a very difficult time doing student by student problem solving. What would be more efficient and effective is for you to sit down as a grade level and talk about how you can analyze and improve the tier 1 reading instruction that every Ollie is learning to read in. So think about this. We could focus on Ollie, one Ollie at a time, or we could focus on the instructional context that every student is learning to read in. I'm suggesting that you can be more effective with more individual students if you take this systems perspective. If you use your grade level team to do system level problem solving. So let me show you how this might play out. I'm just going to jump ahead a bit here. Same 4 steps, same 4 questions in the collaborative problem solving process. This would be done not with a student team, but with a grade level team, using the same kinds of data sources. And it might play out something like this. At the beginning of first grade, 100% of students should name letters, segment phonemes, read CVC words, but only about 50% of our students meet these expectations. So that's the problem that's observably and measurably defined. Then we're going to move into problem analysis. Why are we only getting half of our students to grade level expectations on these skills? Here at step 2 is where you would generate all the things we've been talking about today. What contributes to good, high quality, effective tier 1 reading instruction? We've talked about these things: time and schedule, flexible service delivery, research aligned instructional routines and materials, grouping practices. I know I'm leaving something out, but you get the gist, right? Those are the things that could possibly contribute to these low outcomes. They are things within our control. They are things that we can change. So what comes out of step 2 is a list of factors contributing to these low outcomes, a prioritized list where we're considering if we changed this one thing, it would have a huge impact on everything else. If we could get a change here, it would influence the other factors. And considering, what do we have the resources to do? What's within our means, within our world of reality? That's what should become your hypothesis statement. So you have a list, but the one thing that we're going to work on first is what rises to the top. The priority, the thing that if we changed it, it would have the biggest impact, and we actually have the resources to do it. So that hypothesis is what you write your action plan at step 3 about. In this case, they decided to differentiate tier 1 with explicit and systematic phonics instruction. And when it comes to system level problem solving, we are not using progress monitoring in the same way that we would with students, but we are using our screening data over time to see if the changes that we made, this plan that we put in place, is actually reducing risk. So we would look at the middle of year screening data and to see if fewer students are now at risk. Okay, that's a quick example of how the problem solving process would play out at the student level and at the systems level. Obviously, this is not something that you just take on tomorrow. This is something that you work on over time, that you need training in, that you need coaching and support in to be able to implement. So I'm suggesting that you expand your horizons, if you will, in terms of what you need to be supporting teachers to learn. There's lots of learning that needs to happen around the science of reading, but also around assessments and around instruction. Okay, I want to pause there before we wrap up and see what questions have popped in this last section.
We are looking pretty good in the chat.
Everybody's worn out. They can't type a question because I've worn them out probably.
Well, you've just given them so much content and so much good. You know, there was a comment earlier up in the chat, and I wish I could find the exact one. And somebody very kindly said, I wish every teacher, superintendent, director, board level staff, and there was a list of many, many, many positions were here listening to this right now, because I think it is very much just what we all need to be thinking about, thinking beyond the individual student in terms of how can we align this system, right?
It's such a nice compliment. I appreciate that. And I will push whoever wrote that to say, they all can see this because it's recorded.
They can share it, right? Share it with
Yes.
share it with your superintendent, share it with your trustee, share it with your principal.
Please.
Something that just makes, and this is not something that's coming from the chat. This is just something that is coming from me, but I wonder about what would sort of be a first step for a teacher, right? And it might not be something, maybe that's something where they're aware that screening is coming in September and new standards are coming in September. If somebody doesn't want to wait until 9 months, right? If they're wanting to think about those students who they have in their classroom on Monday, what would you suggest in terms of how that individual teacher could get started? Would that be screening, or what would that look like to you?
Yeah, so for a system to start, you're going to see here on my list of implementation steps to start with screening. Yeah, that's where I think you should start. For an individual teacher, maybe there's a step of talking to your school leader or board leaders about screening, sharing some criteria or some thoughts about, this is a screener we could look into, this is what we should be looking for, that sort of thing. I also think there are 2 first steps for teachers that I might suggest. And they relate to, within the domain of your own individual classroom, things that I think can be powerful first steps. Okay, I'm going to say 3. It's not a first step, it's 1, 2, and 3. You can choose it. Consider it a menu. You can pick from one of these. Here's things that I think can get the ball rolling. Learn some more yourself, like take on some learning about MTSS, about the science of reading. I was looking at the break at everything you were showing in the slide cycle that IDA Ontario is offering. Amazing professional learning. Take advantage of that. Start there. Connect with IDA Ontario and tap into some of their professional learning. I think that's a great starting place. Another option would be change the way you read aloud to your class. Okay, most teachers are reading aloud. If you're not, start. It's within your capacity right now as a teacher. Go back to it and be intentional about what you're reading aloud. Pause as you're reading to have discussion and conversation with your students. That's it. Just elevate the level of oral language in your classroom by reading aloud every day from complex text, not leveled books, complex text, and chat about it with your kids. Okay, I think that's a powerful, it seems small, but it's a powerful place to start. And then a third suggestion would be find a friend in your school. Find a buddy. You might think you're the only one. Maybe you're the only one attending this workshop today, but somewhere lurking in the silence is somebody else who thinks just like you do, who's feeling like, I'm working really hard and I'm not getting the result I want for my kids. Or I'm hearing this chatter about the science of reading, but I don't really know what it means, or I don't know what it means for me, or I wish my leaders were doing something different. Find a buddy, because there's strength in numbers. Find somebody else who you can bounce ideas off of, who you can partner with, who you can feel like you are not alone, who will help you feel like you are not alone. So those would be things I would point to as reasonable first steps. Easy for me to say, I'm not in a classroom. I recognize that, but you can take it for what it is. Outsider's perspective.
Stephanie, there's a really great question. Someone wants concrete examples of how we can involve parents.
Oh gosh, all the things I said earlier about announcing the journey you're on, being upfront about we're learning and these are changes you can expect to see over time. Definitely engage parents that way. Concrete example, listen to parents, listen to them. Listen to them when they are giving you overt messages and, sort of veiled messages. Listen to what they're telling you about their concerns for their children. Communicate about student results and needs as early as possible. And if you're going to phone up and describe the challenges that a child is facing, you probably better have phoned with something positive prior to that. So reach out about both the positives and the challenges. Make sure you're communicating through all your normal channels, through your parent-teacher conferences, through your newsletters, YouTube channels, whatever ways you have to communicate with parents. And don't make it a one-way communication. Use those channels and mechanisms to invite their input. Okay, this is hard, right? Because here you are already taking on lots of new learning and new behaviors. And I'm asking you to open yourself up and be vulnerable and respectfully listen to input from your consumers. I recognize that is not an easy thing to do, but I think it's essential in creating the kind of collaborative environment that will accelerate your student outcomes. When everybody in the school community is, rowing in the same direction, the sky's the limit to what you can do. Not only do you just not have resistance, but you've got momentum. You've got a force behind you where everybody's moving in the same direction. So those would be some things I would put out there as off the top of my head, things I've seen work very effectively to engage parents. It's not just informing them, but seeking their input, seeking their participation. Before I leave this, obviously I said, get them on your teams, right? Like who from the community can represent on those teams. Okay, that's it.
There was one other question that I just think is so valuable, thinking about that piece of where to start and where to seek out reliable information and to build that content. There was a question above and beyond the books that we'll be giving out momentarily. Where do you suggest? I mean, I know your Reading Science Academy is a phenomenal place for people to start in terms of ticking a couple of things off that box of finding a buddy and learning more. Are there any books that you recommend on top of that? I know that you're often posting that on your Facebook page, and we always get to see what you're reading, but what else would you recommend in terms of that knowledge building piece?
Yeah, there are some really, really good books. Anita Archer's Explicit Instruction, #1. Christopher Such's Art and Science of Primary Teaching is #2. And then Tom Bennett's Running the Room is #3. That's my trifecta of where to start with the science of reading in general. The books that you're giving away are my MTSS specific recommendations. Other places that I point people to as far as trusted resources, IDA, obviously, trusted resource within Ontario, within the US as well. The Reading League, I mentioned that US, well, international, I guess, nonprofit devoted to supporting educators to learn about the science of reading. I would point people to the IES guides as a place to learn. And maybe somebody can pull up one to drop in the chat so people know what I'm referring to there. The one on foundational skills or intervention in 4 to 6, or they have parent resources. Those are good resources. Summaries of the reading research. For example, the National Reading Panel report that I mentioned that was commissioned here in the US in 2000. Other more recent compilations of the reading research would appear in research articles. There's one by Castles, Rassel, and Nation that I think is an excellent summary. And I bet Una could search that one up too, to drop into the chat if you wanted to go a little bit deeper. That's a little bit more on the academic side of a summary, but it's good nonetheless. For your administrator, there is a document by an agency called EAB. I have no idea what it stands for. And the title is something like Narrowing the Third Grade Reading Gap. It is a really nicely constructed brochure, if you will, bite-sized, not too tough to digest summary of the reading research, I think primarily aimed at administrators, helping them understand reading research. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there.
I think we could all chat about books and resources forever, right? I think that's something that is, what do they say, a toxic trait? I feel like our toxic traits could be that we could do a lot of reading about reading science, right?
We spend too much on books. Yes, for sure.
That's for sure. That's for sure. I just put those links in the chat. So we've got that there.
Of course, everybody should read this report, right? This is the front cover of the executive summary of your right to read inquiry. And I captured what's at the end of that report. It is time for change. That's the message really that I want to close on here. I mentioned these resources throughout, in addition to the ones that I just said verbally. And I encourage folks to stay connected to me. I'm happy to answer questions after today. I hope that you'll reach out with any feedback or questions that you have. Happy to stay connected in that way. So I'll stop sharing so you all can get down to the fun awarding of prizes.
Well, before we get to the prize, I just want to genuinely say, we are so beyond grateful for you sharing your expertise, your wisdom in the clear and concise way that I think is one of your many strengths in terms of making sure that because this content is so important, and making sure that the people who need to hear it and in a way that works, and in a way that you're getting a whole lot of hearts coming up. I see that from the Zoom.
That's so cute. I've never seen that before in Zoom. I've never earned that kind of reinforcement, and now that I see it,
your
I love
day.
it. That's awesome. Thank you all so much.
A friend of mine texted me midway through the day. She said, everything I wanted this workshop to be, it's even better than that. So we're so incredibly grateful. We cannot say that enough.
I really appreciate your time today. Thanks, IDA Ontario. And thank you to all you wonderful educators who do the work that you do every day.
Thank you.
You're so very welcome. Thank you.